You solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give in this action shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
So you may be seated. And if you please state your full name and then spell it for the record.
Darren, D-A-R-Y-N, Dupree, D-U-P-R-E-E.
Thank you, sir. Whenever you're ready, state, you may proceed.
Thank you. Sir, how did you used to be employed?
I was a detective for the Los Angeles Police Department.
How long were you with the LAPD?
33 and a half years.
And when did you start?
In 1990.
And through the majority of your career, what kind of crimes did you focus on?
Homicides, gang homicides.
I'm going to direct your attention to approximately 2006. Were you asked to be part of a task force related to the Christopher Wallace murder?
Yes, I was.
And can you describe that task force for us?
Robbery homicide, homicide specials, Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, FBI, ATF, and DEA were all a part of the task force.
And was there a precipitating event that caused the 2006 task force to be formed?
Yeah, Christopher Wallace's mother filed a lawsuit against the Los Angeles Police Department.
And what was the allegation in the lawsuit?
That there was police officer involvement in his death.
LA police officer involvement?
Yes.
And what was the purpose of the 2006 task force?
To uncover, first of all, if there was any police officer involvement, and also to hopefully solve the Biggie Smalls murder.
Now, by 2008, this is 11 years after the homicide. I assume that there was records that the LAPD would have gathered initially in the investigation in the ensuing 11 years that you had access to.
Yes.
Did you guys, or did the task force formulate a plan as to how you were going to go about investigating Christopher Wallace murder?
Yeah. There was rumors that this was a war between Southside Compton Crips and Mob Piru, Puffy, Combs label, Bad Boy, and Death Row Records. So we started there, and that consisted of coming to Vegas, getting all their files, getting up to speed on the Tupac murder. Although we weren't investigating it, we just wanted to get up to speed on it. And then starting there, everybody was a suspect at that time in the Biggie Smalls murder.
At the time you come to Vegas and learn what information the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department is, who is the detective that you're having the contact with from Metro?
Detective Dan Long.
At some point, you go back, you begin investigating. Did you have any suspects that you identified and wanted to potentially look at?
From the initial investigation, Southside Compton Crip possibly had something to do with the murder because they weren't paid for the Tupac murder, and then also Death Row Records, that they were involved because of the retaliation for the Tupac murder. So, like I said, everybody was a suspect at that time.
For nearly 30 years, the murder of Tupac Shakur has remained one of the most talked about unsolved killings in hip-hop history. But now, inside a Las Vegas courtroom, jurors have heard something that prosecutors believe could be devastating for the man accused of orchestrating the killing. A recording from a 2008 police interview was played in court, and on that recording, Duane Keffe D. Davis described himself as being inside the white Cadillac that pulled alongside Tupac's BMW on the night the rapper was shot. And then came the detail that immediately grabbed everyone's attention. Davis told investigators that his nephew, Orlando Baby Lane Anderson, was the person who fired the shots. This wasn't a podcast. This wasn't a documentary. This wasn't a story told years later to sell a book. This was an interview with police. And prosecutors are now putting those words directly in front of a jury. According to testimony reported from the trial, Davis described the Cadillac approaching the BMW carrying Tupac and Marion Suge night at a Las Vegas intersection on September 7, 1996. Davis said he was sitting in the front passenger seat, with Anderson and other men inside the vehicle. The courtroom reportedly became extremely quiet as jurors listened to the recording and followed along with the transcript. For Tupac's family members sitting in the courtroom, this was another painful return to a night that changed their lives forever. Tupac was only 25 years old. He had become one of the most influential rappers in the world. And that night, he was riding through Las Vegas with Knight after attending the Mike Tyson fight. Earlier that evening, an altercation had taken place involving Tupac's entourage and Anderson inside the MGM Grand. Prosecutors say that confrontation became the motive for what happened next. Their argument is that the shooting wasn't random. They say it was retaliation. And according to prosecutors, Davis wasn't simply an innocent passenger who happened to be in the wrong car. They accuse him of helping organize the attack and providing the weapon. But here's where this case gets complicated. Davis has pleaded not guilty, and his defense team says the prosecution story is built around statements from a man who has repeatedly changed his story. The defense has essentially told jurors, don't believe him. They argue that Davis has exaggerated or fabricated stories about his involvement, and that his statements should not be treated as reliable proof. That argument is especially important because Davis is not accused of actually pulling the trigger. The prosecution's theory is that he orchestrated the attack, and now prosecutors are asking jurors to decide whether his own words prove that he was part of the operation. But there is another reason this testimony is so significant. Davis didn't just tell one version of the story. Over the years, he gave different accounts in interviews, media appearances, and a 2019 memoir. Some of those statements have now become evidence in the trial, and that creates a major battle for the jury. Is Davis finally telling the truth about what happened, or is this another version of a story he has told for years? Because there is one thing both sides appear to agree on. Duane Davis has talked about Tupac's murder a lot. The difference is what those words actually mean. Prosecutors say his repeated admissions expose his involvement. The defense says those same statements demonstrate why he cannot be trusted. And now, after almost 3 decades of rumors, theories, and unanswered questions, a jury has to decide what happened. But the courtroom has only just begun hearing the evidence. There are expected to be many more witnesses, more recordings, and more arguments over what really happened during those final hours of Tupac Shakur's life. And one question is hanging over the entire trial. If Davis was really inside that Cadillac that night, what exactly did he know? And when did he know it? Stay with me, because the next part of this story gets even more complicated. And before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments. If you're watching from Nigeria, the United States, the UK, South Africa, or anywhere else in the world, I want to know. And if you've been following the Tupac case for years, hit the like button and subscribe, because this trial could finally reveal details that have remained hidden since 1996. Tupac murder trial. The confession that put the entire case in a new light. But then the courtroom heard something that prosecutors had been waiting nearly 3 decades to play for a jury. A voice from 2008, a voice belonging to Duane "Keffe D" Davis. And according to testimony from former LAPD detective Darren Dupree, that conversation began because investigators were actually looking into the murder of another hip-hop legend, Christopher Wallace, better known as the notorious B.I.G.A.T. The time. Davis was being questioned because investigators were exploring whether he knew anything about Biggie's murder. But during that conversation, detectives said Davis made a statement that suddenly connected him to another unsolved killing. The detective testified that Davis denied being involved in Biggie's murder. Then investigators asked about another killing, and according to Dupree's testimony, Davis responded with words that prosecutors now consider extremely important. "We did the other one." Detective testified that, to him, the obvious reference was Tupac. That moment is now one of the most explosive pieces of testimony in the entire trial. Think about what that means. Investigators weren't originally questioning Davis about Tupac's murder. They were investigating Biggie's death. Yet prosecutors say Davis voluntarily brought up another killing and appeared to acknowledge involvement. And that's where the prosecution's case becomes much more complicated, because Davis didn't simply say he knew Tupac. According to the 2008 recording played for jurors, Davis described himself as being inside the white Cadillac that pulled alongside Tupac's BMW. He described the people inside the car. He described the weapon. And most importantly, he described what happened immediately before the shots were fired. According to the testimony, Davis said he passed a gun toward the back of the Cadillac. The weapon eventually ended up with his nephew, Orlando "Baby Lane" Anderson. And prosecutors say Anderson then fired at Tupac's vehicle. Anderson died in 1998 and was never charged with Tupac's murder. That leaves Davis as the only person ever charged in connection with the killing. But here's the question the defense wants the jury to focus on. Can you actually believe Davis? Because his lawyer says absolutely not. The defense has argued that Davis spent years telling exaggerated stories about his alleged involvement. Stories designed to make him look more important than he really was. And that argument matters because Davis has told different versions of the story over the years. In some accounts, he acknowledged being in the car. In others, he denied involvement or pointed toward completely different theories. Now prosecutors are taking those contradictions and putting them under a microscope. They want jurors to see the admissions as evidence that Davis knew exactly what happened. The defense wants jurors to see them as evidence that Davis is simply unreliable. And that creates one of the strangest situations imaginable in a murder trial. The prosecution is essentially saying, believe what Davis said back then. The defense is saying, don't believe what Davis said back then. But both sides are asking the jury to examine the same man, the same words, the same recordings, and the same mysterious night in Las Vegas. And there is another major piece of the prosecution's argument. They say this wasn't a random shooting. They say there was a reason. Earlier that night, Tupac and members of his entourage had been involved in a physical confrontation with Anderson inside the MGM Grand. Prosecutors argue that the confrontation became the spark for retaliation. Hours later, Tupac was sitting in the passenger seat of a BMW with Suge Knight when a white Cadillac pulled alongside them. Shots rang out. Tupac was struck multiple times. He would die 6 days later. Now, almost 30 years after that night, prosecutors are attempting to reconstruct those final moments in front of a jury. And as the evidence continues, one thing is becoming very clear. This trial isn't just about what happened in 1996, it's also about what Davis said afterward. Because for years, Davis talked. He talked to investigators. He talked in interviews. He talked publicly. And he eventually helped tell his version of the story in a memoir. Now those words are coming back to him inside a courtroom, and the jury has to decide whether those words were a confession or the stories of a man trying to make himself sound more powerful than he really was. But there is still another witness whose story could become extremely important to understanding the atmosphere surrounding Tupac that night. And what happened when people connected to both sides of the gang conflict realized what had happened. That testimony could reveal just how quickly Tupac's death turned into something much bigger than a single shooting. So don't go anywhere. And if you're just joining us, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city and country in the comments right now. Because the next part takes us back to the confrontation inside the MGM Grand. The incident prosecutors say may have set the entire chain of events in motion. The night everything changed, the night Tupac Shakur was killed, didn't begin with gunfire. It began with a confrontation. And prosecutors say that confrontation may have been the spark that turned a night in Las Vegas into one of the most infamous murders in music history. It was September 7, 1996. Tupac was in Las Vegas for the Mike Tyson fight at the MGM Grand. The fight itself was already a major event. But after Tyson's victory, something happened inside the hotel that prosecutors now say became critically important to the events that followed. Tupac and members of his entourage encountered Orlando "Baby Lane" Anderson. Anderson was connected to the South Side Compton Crips. According to the prosecution's theory, an altercation broke out between Tupac's group and Anderson. And this wasn't just a verbal argument. Anderson was physically attacked. By the time the confrontation ended, the situation had escalated dramatically. But here's where the story takes another turn. Prosecutors say Tupac's group left the MGM Grand and got into vehicles. Davis was allegedly nearby with several other men. And according to the prosecution, the confrontation at the hotel wasn't forgotten. Instead, they say it became the reason for retaliation. Tupac eventually got into the BMW driven by Death Row Records boss Marion Suge Knight. The two men were heading through Las Vegas when another vehicle appeared, a white Cadillac. The vehicle pulled alongside Tupac and Knight. For a brief moment, the two cars were traveling next to each other. Then everything changed. The Cadillac's occupants opened fire. Tupac was hit multiple times. Knight was also injured, although he survived. The Cadillac immediately sped away, and the shooter disappeared into the darkness. Tupac was rushed to the hospital, but despite doctors' efforts, his injuries were catastrophic. 6 days later, on September 13, 1996, Tupac Shakur died. He was only 25 years old, and the investigation quickly became one of the most frustrating cases in American music history. There were witnesses, there were theories, there were people who claimed to know what happened, but for decades, nobody was arrested. And that's what makes the current trial so extraordinary. Nearly 30 years later, prosecutors finally have a defendant sitting in court. Duane "Keffe D. Davis. But prosecutors aren't claiming that Davis was the man who physically pulled the trigger. Their case is different. They allege Davis helped organize the attack, and they point to his own statements about what happened inside that Cadillac. That's why the former LAPD detective's testimony matters so much. If the jury believes Davis really admitted being inside the vehicle, it places him much closer to the murder than a simple bystander. But there is another problem for prosecutors. The man who allegedly fired the shots is dead. Orlando Anderson was killed in an unrelated gang shooting less than 2 years after Tupac's death. He never stood trial. He never gave a courtroom account. And he never had the opportunity to respond to the allegations. So the jury is being asked to reconstruct the events through evidence gathered years later, police interviews, witness testimony, statements attributed to Davis, and evidence about the relationships between the people involved. The defense knows exactly how difficult that can be. Their argument is essentially that the passage of time has made the case less reliable, memories fade, stories change, people die, and evidence becomes harder to verify. But prosecutors have a different perspective. They say time doesn't erase a confession. If Davis repeatedly described himself as being inside the Cadillac, prosecutors believe those statements can help prove his involvement. And that brings us to one of the biggest questions in this entire trial. Why would Davis talk about the murder at all? Why would a man allegedly involved in one of the most famous unsolved killings in American history tell investigators that he was inside the vehicle? Was he telling the truth? Was he trying to protect someone? Was he trying to make himself look important? Or was he simply telling investigators what he believed they wanted to hear? Those questions could ultimately determine Davis's fate. And there's another detail that makes the case even more fascinating. For years, Davis wasn't exactly hiding from the public. He appeared in interviews. He spoke about his past. He eventually published a memoir. And he openly discussed Tupac's murder. But prosecutors say that public discussion doesn't necessarily help Davis. Instead, they argue that his own words created a trail of admissions that eventually came back to him. The defense, however, says those same words prove the opposite. They say Davis was a storyteller, a man who knew how to attract attention, and a man who had every reason to exaggerate his connection to Tupac's death. Now a jury has to decide which version is closer to the truth. And remember, this is not a trial about whether Tupac was murdered. Everyone knows he was. The question is whether the prosecution can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Duane "Keffe D. Davis was legally responsible for helping make that murder happen. And that is a much harder question. Because after almost 3 decades, the the jury isn't just being asked to look at evidence from one night. They're being asked to look at an entire history of statements, relationships, and alleged admissions. And as the testimony continues, the prosecution is expected to keep going back to the same question. What exactly did Davis know about the shooting? And more importantly, what did he do with that knowledge? If you want to follow every major development in this case, make sure you subscribe. And tell me where you're watching from right now, your city and country. Because in the next part, we're going to get into the testimony that could explain what investigators believe happened inside that Cadillac immediately before the shots were fired. And that detail could be one of the most important pieces of the entire case. Tupac murder trial. What was inside the Cadillac? And this is where the story gets even more disturbing. Because prosecutors aren't only trying to prove that Duane, Keffe D, Davis knew about Tupac's murder. They want the jury to believe he was physically there when the attack unfolded. According to testimony presented in court, Davis described the moments inside the white Cadillac before the shooting, and one detail immediately stood out: the gun. Investigators say Davis told them that a firearm was passed toward the back seat of the vehicle. That detail matters because prosecutors believe the person sitting in the back was Orlando "Baby Lane" Anderson. Anderson was the man investigators have long suspected of being the shooter. The prosecution's theory is that Davis helped facilitate the attack, while Anderson was the person who actually fired the weapon. But there's an important distinction here. Davis has pleaded not guilty, and the prosecution still has to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The fact that someone says something in an interview does not automatically make it true. And that's exactly what the defense wants jurors to remember, because the defense is attacking the credibility of Davis's statements. They argue that Davis has told stories about Tupac for years, and that some of those stories don't perfectly match one another. So now the jury has to look at every version. What did Davis say in 2008? What did he say later? What did he say publicly? And what does the physical evidence actually show? That's where the case becomes a battle between words and evidence. Because Tupac's murder happened before today's world of smartphones, social media, and constant video surveillance. There wasn't a camera recording every movement. There wasn't a phone tracking everyone's location in real time. And there wasn't a massive digital trail showing exactly who was inside that Cadillac. Investigators had to build the case from witness accounts, physical evidence, and information gathered over the years. And for nearly 3 decades, the case remained without an arrest. Then came Davis. In 2023, authorities arrested him and charged him with murder with a deadly weapon in connection with Tupac's killing. Suddenly, a case that had seemed frozen in history was alive again. And now Davis is sitting in court while prosecutors revisit statements he made years ago. But here's something the jury has to consider carefully. Davis wasn't the only person who knew something about that night. Other people were connected to the events surrounding Tupac's death. Some were members of rival gangs. Some were connected to death row records. Some were witnesses. And some are no longer alive. That creates an enormous challenge. Because every missing witness leaves another piece of the puzzle that has to be reconstructed. And prosecutors believe Davis's own words can help fill some of those gaps. The former LAPD detective who testified about the 2008 interview gave jurors an opportunity to hear how investigators understood Davis's statements at the time. But the defense is expected to challenge that interpretation, because context matters. A single sentence can sound completely different depending on what was asked before it. And that's why the recording itself is so important. Jurors aren't simply hearing someone say, "Davis confessed." They're being asked to listen to what Davis actually said and decide what those words mean. Was he describing firsthand knowledge? Was he repeating something someone else told him? Was he exaggerating? Or was he admitting that he was part of the group responsible? Those are completely different possibilities. And the jury has to determine which one makes the most sense based on the evidence. But there's another reason this trial has captured so much attention. Tupac's murder wasn't just another homicide. It became a cultural mystery. For years, fans developed theories about who ordered the shooting, Some believed it was connected to the East Coast-West Coast rap rivalry. Others believed it was a gang retaliation. Others suspected people close to Tupac. And some theories became so extreme that people claimed Tupac was secretly alive. But prosecutors aren't asking the jury to solve every Tupac conspiracy theory. They're presenting a much narrower question. Did Duane Davis participate in the events that led to Tupac Shakur's death? That's it. And that distinction is extremely important, because the internet may have spent decades debating hundreds of theories. The courtroom doesn't have that luxury. The jury can only rely on evidence that is legally presented and arguments that can be supported. And if prosecutors fail to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt, Davis could walk free. But if they succeed, the man who spent decades talking publicly about Tupac could potentially become the first person convicted in connection with the rapper's murder. Think about that. For almost 30 years, Tupac's family had no defendant sitting in court. Now they do. And sitting across from them is a man prosecutors say knows more about that night than he has ever admitted. But the defense says the opposite. They say Davis has talked too much, changed his story too often, and cannot be trusted. And that leaves the jury with one enormous question. Are they listening to a confession or a story? Because before this trial ends, they're going to have to decide. If you're following this case, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next update. And comment below with where you're watching from. I want to know how far Tupac's story has reached Nigeria, America, the UK, Canada, Jamaica, South Africa, or anywhere else in the world. Because in the next part, we're going to look at the evidence prosecutors believe connects Davis to the planning of the attack, and why the word retaliation could be one of the most important words in this entire trial.